Joining us in the Informer studio is Greg Barton, a chance to talk about what's happening in the Middle East. It seems to me, I've been in the media for the better part of 45 years. I've been talking about it for all of that time. The latest developments are not the sorts of things we want to see. You're one of the country's top experts, not only on what's happening around the globe, but also on international affairs. You're the Professor of Global Islamic Politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute. Can you see a way forward out of this morass at the moment that is engulfing Israel and, of course, the Palestinians who are living in what must be the most difficult circumstances one can imagine?
I think we can see two sorts of things, George. We can see parameters that are fairly fixed we're going to have to deal with. Yep. And then we can see the challenges of the responses we need to make.
Who can address them? Who can fix them, Greg?
What we're witnessing is at the moment a failure of leadership on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So it does need to be addressed with leadership. It will need external help. There's no getting away from the fact that what the Biden administration does will be...
Has the change in America in terms of the presidencies, we've got Trump is gone, Joe Biden's in. Has that encouraged or sparked or seen either side see this as an opportunity to make a move?
We don't know that clearly. We know that Biden came into office with a lot of things that he wanted to do and some things he really didn't want to engage with.
This is one of them, I bet.
He didn't want to engage with this issue with Israel and Palestinians because it was just so hard, and because his predecessors had tried hard, going back to Jimmy Carter before, through Clinton and Obama. And with all the things he had on the table to do, this was one thing he didn't want to do. Although he did indicate he would be dealing with Iran, and there's a connection between Iran and Hamas, so in a sense he was never going to be able to walk away from this. But things have changed in America, to get to your point. We've just come out of some really hopeful changes with Black Lives Matter movements.
Yes.
Hopeful changes in US politics. Joe Biden is president because of people like Stacey Abrams and other women of colour who did a ground campaign that gave him Georgia in the presidential election and then in the Senate runoff. And of course his vice president is a woman of colour, an Asian, African-American vice president. Wonderful. People's expectations are different. 7.5 million Americans identify as being Jewish, and for those who can vote, the vast majority who are not ultra-Orthodox, vote Democrat. And in the past they said, well, we stand for Israel and we stand for democracy, justice, human rights, and they didn't always want to try and resolve how those things worked out. Now they're, I think, increasingly saying, we care for people, we care for values, and as much as we care for Israel, Israel has to lift its game. It has to be the better version of itself. So I think pressure from American Jews through the Democratic Party will force this Democratic president and administration to do better, because frankly, the last 12 years with Netanyahu, he inherited a difficult situation. It's not all his fault.
No.
But he did nothing to advance the peace process and a lot to reverse it.
But there are so many players, all wanting a piece of the action, all capable of moving a card and creating upheaval.
Yeah, there are.
And we're not talking just in Israel and just in Palestine. We're talking, as you said, Hamas. We're also talking Iran.
We are, but we sort of need to go back to these parameters that we probably can't change. And one is, for years and years, we lived with this acceptance of Israel occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and before that the Gaza Strip, which is sort of, it has under its control, but it doesn't occupy now. Yeah. On the basis that eventually would have a two-state solution, a peace solution, right?
And
that window of opportunity for a two-state solution almost definitely has closed. I mean, the West Bank is so divided and carved up with settlements, and given the way things have played out with occupation, it doesn't seem feasible that there will be a separate Palestinian state. And of course, with Hamas in charge of 2 million people sort of captive in the Gaza Strip, that's not conducive to a Palestinian state. We are increasingly at a point where we've got 14.5 million people, slightly more of whom are Palestinian and Arab Israelis, 7 million who are Jewish Israelis, living in one land. And so the question is, how do two people live in one land? It would be ideal to have two states living peacefully, side by side neighbours. It looks like it'll have to be one state that does a much better job of being a fair and equitable state. Because at the moment, if you take it as one state, admittedly it's very complex. Some people are in an awful situation, some people are in an unfair situation, and some people are in a reasonable situation, but no one's entirely happy.
Extraordinary stuff. Speaking of not being happy, what are we to make of the rather controversial Belt and Road initiative that we saw emerge in Victoria over the last couple of years? We saw the state government of Daniel Andrews say, we're going to accept this terrific opportunity presented to us by China to create some wonderful infrastructure at a cost that we think is manageable and fair. And of course the federal government over the last few months has come up and said, look, we don't believe that is something that we should be supporting. This Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, that's being rolled out across the Pacific. We think it has tentacles that aren't good for the safety of Australia, the sovereign security of Australia. Has the federal government their stance rather, is it fair? Is it unfair? And was Victoria trying to do the right thing at the beginning?
I think we need to go back and...
Let's unravel that if we can.
We need to ask ourselves the question, George, of what's in Australia's best interest. You mentioned Belt and Road, but we're talking about Australia's relationship with China.
Correct.
And at the moment, we're in a slightly dangerous position because the old adage is you're supposed to talk softly and carry a big stick.
Yes.
We talk loudly and we're carrying a twig, which we can't use. Right? If a stick is involved, it'll be an American stick.
We should also add that China has been the main producer of so many Australian products for the better part of the last 30 years.
Yeah, the relationship...
On one level, economic is extraordinary.
The relationship with China is very, very important to Australia.
Yeah.
At least 1.2 million Australians have Chinese heritage, many not from mainland China, but it's part of literally part of our DNA.
The economy of Victoria was based around the education sector, and the education sector, many of its students were out of Asia, and many of them from China.
Yeah, our international student economy, if you like, which was sort of half students from China, $40 billion.
That's an awful lot of investment.
Looking at the most recent federal budget, you wouldn't recognise that because there was no acknowledgement of that problem, which is obviously tied up with closure of borders and COVID. But to go back to this question, our relationship with China is important and it's not going to go away. But things have changed in Beijing under the leadership of Xi Jinping, and it presents difficulties for us, and there are some uncomfortable truths that we have to deal with. But we, as a medium power, very much deeply engaged with China, are not in a position to change all the things that we'd like to change. We sort of have to find our way through this, and we have to negotiate a more healthy relationship with China, which will include speaking truth to power with some grace, but also recognising there are other things we're not going to be able to change. And it's fair enough to point out to our neighbours that Belt and Road loan deals can saddle them with oppressive amounts of debt, so we that's fair enough to caution. But we went back when Victoria was signing, largely symbolic Belt and Road agreements with China. That was in a more innocent time, not that long ago, when we didn't have so much apprehension about where China was going. So
was it also a case of Victoria being used as a bit of a project by China, saying to the rest of the world or the rest of the Pacific, look what we can do in Victoria and what we are doing there?
I think the reality
is... roll out that model across the Pacific? No?
There's no such thing as a free Peking duck luncheon, George. I mean, if somebody comes to you and wants to have a photo op to signing agreements, it's probably because they think it's of value. And we didn't think those agreements were much more than symbolic, but they were clearly of symbolic value. So that's the reality. But a more substantial agreement that was signed was giving a century-long lease on the port of Darwin to a Chinese government company with links to the government and the military. That's more substantial, and so selectively looking back at history and being critical of some things and not others isn't helpful to how we go forward from here. I mean, we have to engage these difficult questions, but we're not going to advance things by just making this a thing about party politics.
Speaking about China and the way it's changed over the last say, decade. I notice that it's not just Australia taking that stance. There are Chinese billionaires who've also come under fire. Jack Ma,
Yes.
who was at one stage one of the most powerful men in the world, suddenly disappeared.
Yeah, there are lots of things to be very, very famous, prominent Chinese and Chinese Australians have suddenly been disappeared. Sometimes they reappear later on and things are resolved. Sometimes, sadly, they're indefinitely detained. The Chinese state can do what it wants, particularly this Xi Jinping regime. And one feature of his power is it has been increasingly authoritarian, and it has involved him eliminating rivals and competing power blocks. So, not even a billionaire, Jack Ma, is free of that. But it's a really complex space. Every major company that engages with China faces opportunities and also challenges. So, recently there's revelations about the degree of freedoms that Apple signed away to its factories in China.
Exactly, that's what we're finding out. Look, in this increasingly complicated world we're living in, it seems to me there are so many levers and tilts and balances that need to be, finely tuned and kept in check. And it doesn't take much to move them the wrong way or the right way. Is that your view?
You're absolutely right, George. We need to recognise as the old Chinese saying go, we do live in interesting times. That was not meant as a blessing, but it has its blessings. But we need to be cautious. We need to be wise. We need to recognise where our interests lie. We need to be mature. I mean, talking softly and carrying a big stick does make sense. If you don't have a big stick, at least being wise in the way you talk. So we have to negotiate a future with China. We want to engage with difficult issues like those in the Middle East, including in Israel and Palestine. We need to recognise there aren't simple solutions. We need to recognise the layers of competing interests. We need to recognise that so many of the problems we face in the world today are not acts of God or climate or anything else. It's failure of political leadership, and for us to take the leadership we need on difficult things, including climate, actually.
And is there something that maybe our political leaders, our federal leaders can look at and take stock and think to themselves, maybe we should start addressing the good of Australia as a nation, rather than just our view of the situation at the moment. For example, we have the federal government in a pandemic at one stage saying it has a national unity government or national unity committee that works on so many things, and yet on one of the most precious and vital things, that is our stance with China, we're bickering. It's not a bipartisan approach.
George, the health of our democracy goes up and down in waves. We are in a low ebb at the moment. We don't have visionary leadership in our current federal leadership. We've just had a budget, but we didn't have effective response to COVID-19, the pandemic, and questions of quarantine. How do we bring Australians back, including those stuck facing terrible conditions in India? How do we bring this $40 million international student economy business back online? Really big and important things. What we see is a lot of symbolism, announcements, photo opportunities that it's very partisan and very personal. We don't see big vision pieces. I mean, I'm not saying that everything is bad. The fact that we're spending a lot of money on trying to stimulate the economy is good. I fully give credit where it's due. But where's the vision to build infrastructure? Where's the vision to build a transition to renewable energy? Where's the vision to engage with our region? Where's the vision to build up our TAFE and university sector? None of that was in the budget. There's just, it seems almost a vacuum of vision and big picture. It's all partisan, and it's not even just partisan, it's all about individuals wanting to hang on to power.
But you touched on it earlier too. It's a failure of government and failure of vision across the globe.
Yeah, we spoke earlier about this terrible situation in Israel and the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip. That was always going to be difficult to get right. But when you've got a failure of political leadership on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side at the same time, that it just means lots of suffering for ordinary people. And we need to unpack the difference between ordinary Chinese and the particular regime that's in charge ordinary people in Israel, Palestine, and who's leading, and recognise that when leaders let ordinary people down, ordinary people suffer and pay the price.
Well done. Greg Barton, giving us not only some perspective, but some insight into some extraordinarily difficult moments in our history. We're all feeling it, we're all facing it, but our governments also need to take stock and see where they've dropped the ball and what they can do to make things better. Greg Barton in the studio. Thank you.
Thank you.